Okay, so the seven elements, gosh, they've been around since 2016, I believe, 2015. So I'm going to talk about what they are, how we can use them, and then and I feel really strong, like Astroluma wants to come in and definitely do an attunement process so that it can be experienced not through the intellect, but through the expression of the body, because the seven elements are part of the way that we experience consciousness and the way that we can ascend consciousness or the experience of consciousness. And everything that was shared today was so beautiful because it supports exactly what the teaching was saying, that there's no coincidences. I know it always just all comes together so beautifully. So the first element, and I want you to see as we go through them, it's almost like the journey of consciousness as well. So the first and second element kind of go together, and it's I'm not my thoughts and I'm not my mind. That would be the first experience of if we're consciously become aware of a thought that, let's say, brings in suffering of some sort. So whether that's like with Judith, she knew she was safe, but then her body is telling her something else. Well, a lot of times, people that aren't maybe as conscious would have actually let their consciousness move into the chemical of the body and had thoughts like, oh, I'm not safe. Like, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna. And she could have gone into a completely different direction, but she was conscious enough that she knew she could stay in that frequency, knowing that she was safe. And even though her body was telling her something else, that's consciousness. So an example could be, um, well, I don't know how, I'm just going to make something up now. I don't have the money to pay my rent. And oh my gosh, I'm going to get kicked out and I'm going to live on the streets and I'm going to have a grocery cart. And you just go into the spiral. Well, and then there's this part of you that kind of pulls out of that story and it's like, wait a minute. No, I do trust that I'm going to have the money to pay my rent, and I don't need to go down the spiral the way that I'm going. So that would be when we could call in the first element of I'm not my thoughts. So when we do that, it activates a frequency that replaces the identity of thought with a pure frequency. So if I'm not my thoughts, what am I? And then when that frequency is downloaded or absorbed, we always say I absorb the elements because there are elements. It's just really all you're doing is you're activating a frequency of what you are beyond thought. That frequency is being held in the body and then it's absorbed into consciousness and you have an experience beyond that. So if I'm not my thoughts, what am I? Well, guess what? When we ask that question, the consciousness has to go to open to receiving the answer. Well, when you activate the first element of I'm not my mind, it's releasing a frequency where you move into the identity of the frequency of source. And then you have that experience. So that's just that one element can totally change your life. So every time that you activate that first element and have that experience, something is happening. It's attuning your consciousness. And the more you do it, the more it starts to break down all of the identities that are connected to limitation of thought. First element. Second element that goes with it is I'm not my mind. Well, the mind is the factory that is firing off all, you could say, the synapse responses or those ruts that are repeated thoughts. Like, how many times have you had something happen and you go through the same thoughts like a million times? and it never goes anywhere. Well, that's the firing of the synapse responses. Or you have an experience and you go back to and you go into the same thought every single time. This also can show up in relationships where you're triggered and you go into a relationship of loop where no matter what it is that started the relationship, you're having the same exact fight. That would be the program of the mind, is it wants to repeat the same thing. Same thing. So when you know that you're in a repeated thought, is when you could bring in the second element. I'm not my mind. Activate the second element, and then it activates. So if I'm not my mind and I'm not my thoughts, what am I? Well, in that moment, that element is working with reprogramming the synapse responses of the mind, running through those synapses, because the synapses are electricity, right? It's attuning that electricity to the frequency of not identifying within the mind. Well, what are you going to identify in? The frequency of source. So that is the second element. So anytime you're looping in thought, which of course is the first part of consciousness too, is becoming aware of what's going on up there, right? All right, so then we can move into the third element, which is I am energy that fluctuates in vibration. So knowing what vibration that you're in is a huge part. So another way is sometimes people will put, I'm not my body. So I'm not in Judith's situation where she mastered consciousness over the frequency or the synapse or the chemical response of her body, that she was doing the third element. So it's when the body releases or is stuck in the primal programming that we're not allowing consciousness to move in and have the experience of primal programming, and can stay outside of it and know that the body can fluctuate in vibration depending on if it's in a chemical response or not, but that it always can stabilize in the one frequency of the body that is always the same. And that frequency is your DNA, and that frequency is 963. So if we are fluctuating in vibration, then we know I'm not my body. Well, what am I? I am that one stable frequency of source. So our consciousness has somewhere to go when we release that element, has to absorb it. So it releases, it absorbs, consciousness is attuned, and we have something to experience. Again, if I'm not my body, then what am I? And when we open up the I am, we have the ability to ascend. And then, of course, after you do the seven element clearing through the scalar, what do? We download the I am. So in this case, you can say, well, I am, I am source. I am source. Third element. All right. Fourth element is nothing exists outside myself. All right. So this is the one that really challenges us to take full responsibility of how we're experiencing reality. Because if nothing exists outside myself, that means how my consciousness is projecting is creating my reality. So it brings us back inside. So if nothing exists outside of myself, what am I experiencing right now? What am I projecting? I love this one too because it keeps us from going into victim mentality, because we can't blame what's going on outside of ourselves because of an experience that we're having inside of ourselves. It turns that inside out, and we have choice. Is this the projection of consciousness that I want to be experiencing? And if it's not, what do I want to experience? So if nothing exists outside of myself, and then if we go to the element that's right before that, and that is, if I'm not my body, what am I? I'm source. Well, if nothing exists outside of myself and I'm source, then whatever the expression that I can move into is going to be of source. Fourth element. Fifth element, I can't remember. Fifth and sixth go together. So if I get these out of order, just bear with me. Is my reality is an illusion. So if nothing exists outside myself, and we bring in this the sixth element, is when it's supporting nothing exists outside myself. So what's supporting that? Well, everything that I see within my reality is a distorted reality. It's a distortion because I'm observing it. And if it's observed, then I know there is a gap between the part of me that's observing it and what is actually there. And that gap is my programming, because consciousness is projecting through a distortion that's creating reality. And so if we know that my reality is an illusion, guess what happens? I have a choice on whether I want to agree with the illusion, or if I know that I'm only seeing part of the whole. And when I know that I'm only seeing part of the whole, it opens up space for the frequency of source to fill in the gap of what is true. So I go inside. I go inside. I love using this one, especially when I'm feeling good, because then I can start to look at reality and I can say, okay, I know what I'm seeing is an illusion. Show me what it really is. And just like where we started this with Kelly, is that it starts to show you, right? And in order to know what it really is, it forces you to go into a conscious place of stillness, openness, allowing it to inform consciousness in a space that it wasn't being held into before. And all of a sudden, consciousness starts to evolve. Instead of identifying in everything all the time, we challenge it. What is it really? And then when you're challenged with things that, when you don't feel good, it's a lot easier to know what to do with this element, allowing it to absorb and then start to open up to, oh, okay, so this is the illusion. And if it is the illusion, I don't have to identify in it. I don't have to create a reality around it. I can move back in and allow source to inform it. Which brings us to the next element. And this is when it starts to get really, oh, I'm going to say a little more challenging consciously, right? Because we have to remember consciousness, when it's used as an identity, keeps us looping in the illusion. So the next one would be to bring that inside and say, okay, not only is my reality an illusion, but so am I. I am an illusion. My concept of self is distorted. Who I think I am, what I think I know, how I'm experiencing my body is distorted. Why? Because I'm observing it. I'm observing it. And if I'm observing it and my consciousness is naming it, then I know that I just moved consciousness into identity instead of using it as a tool. So what do? I'm absorbing the sixth element. I too am an illusion. So if I'm an illusion, who am I? If I'm an illusion, what am I? And then what happens? Consciousness goes from identifying in the self to opening itself up to receiving the answer of what am I? And then when it's in an attuning space where it's waiting to be informed, you're in the purity of source. You don't have to identify in order to exist. Which brings us to the last element. I do not exist. Releasing that element allows consciousness to fully move into the frequency of source beyond identity. So the part of you that says, I exist, is consciousness and observation of the self that is also an illusion. So then we move consciousness into space of I do not exist, because consciousness is the identity of self. It is not the self itself, right? Because you are the frequency of source. And to truly be the frequency of source in expression, there is no identity of that. It is an intelligence beyond consciousness. Consciousness is the tool that we use to remember who we are. And once we remember, fully embody and release, and do not need to have an identity in order to exist, we fully become the expression of source. So these 7 elements are part of the scalar. So when you are running this part of the technology, you are releasing the 7 elements in the body. And this is one of the reasons we have so many amazing shifts of consciousness, because the elements begin to run through your body. You start to become aware of thoughts more easily, perceptions. You start to challenge them. You start to challenge your reality, and you start to move into a space of stillness and recognize that in the stillness, you still exist, but you're not identifying.